In cooperation with the Valiani Corporation of Italy, Fletcher Terry now brings you Mat Pro. This all-mechanical workhorse facilitates increased efficiency with no loss in accuracy on small or large production runs. Available in 2 sizes, Mat Pro executes multiple opening and straight line cuts flawlessly, and all without having to move the mat from its initial pneumatically clamped position. And now, here's John Raines with more on the Fletcher Terry Mat Pro mat cutters.
Hi, I'm John Raines, professional picture framer from Appleton, Wisconsin, also a consultant for the Fletcher Terry Company. I'd like to introduce you to the brand new Mat Pro 120 and 150 pneumatic mat cutters. These pneumatic mat cutters are manufactured in Italy by Valiani, sold and supported in the United States and North America by the Fletcher Terry Company. The Mat Pro 120 has a cutting capacity of 32 by 48 inches. The Mat Pro 150 has a cutting capacity of 40 by 60 inches. Both machines include the following components: the machine standing behind me, the stand in which it's been mounted to, the cutting head, which comes in its own separate box, which you will need to assemble onto the machine. We'll show that a little bit later. 5 Allen keys for doing adjustments, 1 box of 10 blades, 1 wrench for assembling the stand, the manual, and the video that you're now watching. The major components on the Mat Pro pneumatic mat cutter include 2 switches on the left side of the machine. The lower switch controls air control to the cutting head itself, while the upper switch controls air control to the clamping mechanism holding the mat board in place. There are also 2 switches on the cutting head here. The lower black switch controls the head moving up and down to the surface of the mat, and the upper red switch controls the blade entering and exiting the mat surface. You'll also note that there are scales and stops, 2 on the horizontal control, 2 on the upper horizontal control, which limit the travel of the cutting head horizontally. Also stops on the top and bottom of the gantry, controlling travel of the cutting head vertically. Each of these measuring stops has a star dial, and this allows the user to add different increments of dimension to their mat sizes. Once you've mounted your Mat Pro to its stand, save the packaging materials, set them aside. We need to install the 2 handles on either side of the central carriage. Allen keys included with the machine enable you to install these properly on both sides. You then need to install the cutting head, removing it from its box, installing the blade, and then attaching the 2 pneumatic tubes coming from the central carriage. These are color-coded, a blue tube for the upper quick release, and we simply push that into its slot, and the same thing with the second hose, and these 2 are now securely attached to the cutting head. We then take the cutting head, where you'll see there's a small detent button putting the head into its correct position, and 2 locking screws, when turned clockwise, have small locking plates which hold the cutting head securely into position. Once the cutting head is securely mounted, we can then release all of the measuring stops, allowing the carriage and the gantry to move in its operating position. Behind your Mat Pro, on the stand, your air source is attached, and of course it should be a clean, dry air source, but you will find a regulator that has a filter and a lubricator combined. The regulator controls the pressure going into the machine, which is set at the factory at 6 bar. It should not be set any lower than 5 and no greater than 7 bar for optimum performance. To install a new blade into the cutting head or to replace a blade, I'm going to loosen the two tightening screws that hold the head in position and carefully remove the cutting head. You'll find that to facilitate support of the head while you're changing the blade, it's a good idea to stabilize the head in the lock position using the stops and invert the cutting head so that it is now positioned back into the carriage and you have access to the blade to change it easily. To loosen the blade, using the 2.5 millimeter Allen key included with the machine, we loosen the tightening plate and slide the blade outward through the nose of the cutting head. When installing a new blade, it's important to slide it into the channel carefully and in its correct position. You'll know it's in its correct position when the small detent at the back of the blade is inside of the blade and the top of the blade is resting against the upper portion of the magazine. And then retightening the locking plate, holding the blade in position. We can then invert the cutting head back into its operating position using the detent button for positioning, and once again tightening the two locking screws holding the cutting head against the carriage. On the back of the cutting head, you'll notice a small depth indicator dial. It is set from the factory at 1.5 millimeters, or 1.5, which is this controlled depth to cut sufficiently through most 4-ply mat board. So before we test our blade depth, we should make sure that this indicator is resting at 1.5 right here. The cutting head itself also pivots and locks at each 90-degree position, running to the right horizontally, downward vertically, to the left horizontally, and upward vertically. To do our blade test, we're actually going to run it in a downward position, depressing the black head control so that the red wheels, the red roller, is positioned on the surface of our test mat, and the blade is suspended over the slip sheet. At this point, we can now depress our red button, dropping the blade and testing if it makes contact with the slip sheet and lightly grazes that surface without cutting too deeply, but just enough that now we know that our machine will cut sufficiently through 4-ply material. If you notice a small curve in the corners, whether it be an inside turn or an outside turn, sometimes referred to as a hook or a pinch, this may be the blade not traveling in the right position. These minor adjustments can be made to the cutting head by loosening this one Allen key, Allen bolt right here, loosening this and making minor adjustments, 1 or 2 degrees, and then retightening, putting the traveling head in a slightly different position. If you have technical problems making these adjustments, please refer to your manual or call the 1-800 number at Fletcher Terry for customer service to help you. The most accurate and precise way to determine if our depth has been set properly so that we've got sufficient cutting all the way through our material and minimal overcuts and no undercuts is to cut a V-groove. I'm using a 16 by 20 sample board in this case, which I place on top of the underlayment or slip sheet, and I take then the board and the underlayment and slide both of them all the way to the left so that both are engaged under the vertical clamp and the horizontal clamp. When they're in their proper position, I can then clamp the mat down. I'm now going to change my depth adjustment on the blade by switching from 1.5 millimeters to about 1 millimeter for a V-groove. And to cut the V-groove, I now need to set up my stops to cut the V-groove all the way around the mat blank. To set up our measuring stops to cut this V-groove, I'll start with the bottom horizontal stop and set it to 2 inches. This will place my V-groove at 2 inches all the way around the perimeter. I'll then set the vertical bottom stop at 2 inches. This is therefore my starting corner in the lower left. Traveling upwards, I need to stop it 2 inches from the top of the mat. 16-inch mat minus 2 inches puts my upper stop at 14. The right stop is then set for 20 inches of the length of the mat. Minus 2 is 18 inches. And this will put my V-groove at 2 inches all the way around the perimeter of the mat board. To start my cuts, I'll move the cutting head to the upper left position. And turning the air supply on the cutting head, I'll lift the cutting head off and orient the directional arrows so that the cutting head is running horizontally to the right. Reconfirm that I'm set to 1 millimeter in depth. I depress the blade and bring the head across all the way to the measuring stop. Release the blade, depress the head, rotate clockwise until the head falls into its detent position. Depress the blade and continue downward. Again to the end of the stop. Depress, rotate. Now we're traveling horizontally to the left. Depress the blade. And we finish on the fourth side. That's actually half of the V-groove. We now need to complete the second part of the cut, in which case we'll lift the head, rotate, not 90, but 180 degrees so that the blade is traveling downward anti-clockwise or counterclockwise. Depress the blade. You can see the V-groove falling out. Again, 90-degree turn. We might want to remove the excess V-groove material so that it doesn't get trapped under our red roller. Press the blade. And follow all the way around, repeating the action, cutting our V-groove. If the machine has been calibrated properly on blade depth and the red roller setting, our corners should be clean with minimal overcut and no undercut. We can examine this more closely and make any fine-tune adjustments if necessary. Now that we're pleased with our depth setting and we've executed a V-groove, we're going to go ahead and use this mat as a sample mat to cut a single opening in the same mat. With the V-groove sitting at 2 inches, we would like our total mat to be 2.5 inches. Another ½ inch extended in the interior from the V-groove. You'll notice that on all 4 stops we have these star dials. By switching the star dial to a setting of 1/2 of an inch on all 4, this enables us to make the same cuts over again, simply 1/2 of an inch in all directions. Those star dials have multiple increments, 9 exact: 0, 1/8 of an inch, 3/16, 1/4 inch, 3/8, 7/16, 1/2, 5/8, and 3/4. You'll note that on the star dial these increments are color-coded. This is a visual aid to facilitate which increments you can jump to when doing multiple layers. For example, if we're sitting at 1/8, we can add our second layer by going up to 3/8 of an inch or anything greater. In our example again, we're going back to 1/2 of an inch, and so the upper stop is set to 1/2 an inch. The lower stop is dialed to 1/2, the right stop, and the left stop. We're now ready to cut our opening. The one thing I do need to change is our depth. Our depth was set at 1 millimeter, and I'll change the depth dial back to 1.5 for our standard 4-ply material. I'll then lift the cutting head, drop the head into position, drop the blade in, turn, cutting again clockwise, releasing the clamp, bringing the head up, and now we've added an opening to our V-groove mat. Now that we've set up and calibrated our Mat Pro, we're now going to show you how to cut a variety of mat designs. We just completed a single mat with a V-groove. We're now going to cut a double mat, and we'll go ahead and add a V-groove to that double mat as well. We can actually cut up to 3 layers. In fact, we may do that as well. Again, starting with a 16 by 20 board, I position this up against the vertical and the horizontal clamps, securing the board in position. I bring my head up to the magnetic stops and make sure that each of the star dials is set at 0. In this case, once again, we'll cut our V-groove at 2 inches from the exterior. So I've got my stops appropriately positioned, and they all read 0. Setting my blade depth to 1 millimeter. Rotate, and begin cutting clockwise. Rotating 180 degrees and going counterclockwise. Now we're going to cut our opening, and in this case, I'll set my opening for 2 7/16, 7/16 of an inch from the V-groove to the opening. So I'll use my star dials, set those to the blue setting of 7/16, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Upper left against the magnetic stop, turning the dial in position, and readjusting the depth setting to 1.5. Drop the blade in. And cut the opening. As you can see in my example here, we've now cut the opening for our top layer, our top mat. And I had already assembled the 2 boards together. So my black board is already, my second layer, has already been attached to the top layer, and the board is still in position. Without changing the position, we'll simply take our star dial and add the new dimension for the second layer. So I will go from 7/16 to 3/4. Once again, changing all 4 of the star dials, and once again beginning in the upper left position, rotating so that I'm running horizontal, dropping the head down, depressing the blade, and traveling to the right, rotating, downward, to the left, and upward. And that's how easy it is to do a double mat. To do a triple mat, we would simply add another dimension to increase this even further. In our example here, I think I'm going to add a larger substantial amount, so I'm going to add another full inch. So I'm going to change the position of all my stops inward 1 inch. Upper, right, lower, and left to 3 inches, where I'm actually cutting 3 3/4 inches into the interior. Always starting again in the upper left, position the head, and make the cuts. Now we've cut a triple mat with a V-groove. In the next custom mat we're going to cut, I'd like to execute a single offset corner, that is a single step mat. And I'm going to put two boards together, making it a double mat. And at the same time, let's go ahead and put a double track V-groove on the outside. Now, in your own shop, you're more than likely going to be working out the dimensions of the customer's artwork, calculating the border widths, and coming up with an overall design, as I've done here. In the examples, of course, I'm using simple 16 by 20 outside perimeters. Once the math work is done, it's good to refer to that, but also you're working from the exterior in, and so the star dial does facilitate the whole operation. Once again, I put my double mat, both layers, adhered together, up against the underlayment, and slide both up against the clamps, both vertical and horizontal, so they're engaged, and make sure the mats are secured in position. I'll set my stops to 2 inches away on all sides, so 16 becomes 14. 2 inches on the left side, 2 inches on the bottom, and 18 inches on the right side. And go ahead and make sure that all of the star dials are set to 0. And indeed they are. I'm now ready to cut my V-groove. But I mentioned that I'd like to cut a offset V-groove, one crisscrossing over the other. So what I'll do is make the two vertical positions different by adding 1/4 of an inch. This will bring them in 1/4 of an inch closer, turn the cutting head into its correct position, and setting the depth indicator to 1 millimeter. I'm now ready to cut part of my V-groove. Okay. That's one of the V-grooves, where the width is further away on the two horizontal sides and closer on the two vertical sides. I'll now swap the dimensions and once again do the same thing. (180°). And in a very quick amount of time, we have actually cut a double track V-groove with precision. Now that we've cut a double track V-groove with an offset corner, we're going to cut our double mat also with an offset corner. So with the V-groove sitting at 2 and 2 1/4 inches respectively, let's make our opening sit at 3 with the offset of 1/4 inch. So our two dimensions would be 3 and 3 1/4. Placing our mat board back up against the two clamps, we will then change our scales of our stops 3 inches inward. So we go to 13. And 17. Three. And of course, 3 again. Setting 2 of the stops at 0 and 2 of them, in this case the 2 vertical stops, to 1/4 inch. Changing our blade depth setting to 1.5. We're ready to make our cuts. Because we want the window, the fallout, to come out in pieces, we'll actually do a skip cut along the two horizontal portions of this cut. So I'll drop the blade head, the head down first, then the blade, making part of the cut, lifting up, and cutting the last remaining section. Cutting the vertical side completely, and then a skip again, and a full cut on the two vertical sides, breaking the horizontal cuts. We now reverse the stops, setting the vertical stops to 0 and the horizontal stops to 1/4 of an inch. Quarter, quarter, 0, 0, and do the same thing, repeating the pattern, except this time the complete cuts will be along the horizontal part of the mat. Skip on the vertical cuts, complete cut on the horizontal. There's our offset corners, mimicking the same design that we've designed in our V-grooves. After completing the offset corner on the top mat, which matches the V-groove, the second layer should be cut separately. However, we can use the stops set in their same exact position by simply adding the new increment, in this case 3/16 of an inch. After cutting the second mat, the two layers can then be adhered together, lining up the center so that they match perfectly. In the previous examples that I just cut for you, we cut multiple layered mats, 2 layers and 3 layers. With the Mat Pro 120 and 150, we can remove the slip sheet and actually add a 4th layer. What this does, this enables us to use the machine in a production type mode by taking 4 layers not attached of the same mat blank, in this case 11 by 14. I can place all 4 mat blanks underneath and under both vertical and horizontal clamps, clamping them in position. Moving the cutting head over, in our 11 by 14 example, I'll set the margins at 2 inches, 2 inches. Therefore, the top stop would be at 9, and the right stop would be at 12. Make sure they're all at 0 on the star dial, and we're ready to actually cut in a production mode. Turning our air source on. And after cutting each mat, removing the top layer, setting it aside, reclamping, we're down to 2 layers. And after completing 3 mats, we'll go ahead and take our next stack of 3 blank boards and slide them behind the previous 4th mat, giving us a starting point of 4 more layers. It is estimated that in a production mode that the operator can cut approximately 250, 300 mats in an hour in this manner. With most of the mat designs we've done up till now, we've cut the mats from the face on the Mat Pro 120 and 150. Now we're going to do an inlaid mat, and probably the best way to do this is actually to cut the mat from behind so that the fallouts fit precisely together. In our example here, I've chosen 2 different colors. This will be our top mat, and this will be the inlaid portion. So I'll begin by placing the 16 by 20 blank face down this time, up against the slip sheet, so that both the slip sheet, the underlayment, and the mat blank are both engaged under our clamps. And when they are, I can go ahead and clamp them in position. I've set the stops to 2 inches all the way around, of which I've added 3/8 of an inch. 3/8, 3/8, and 3/8 on the star dials. And I'm ready to cut, again clockwise, producing a reverse bevel. Positioning the cutting head so it's oriented the right direction, putting the blade down. I'm cutting out the opening of the top mat. And before I release this board, I'm going to go ahead and mark the bottom of it so that I can reorient this mat blank back into the exact same position on the machine. In fact, I'll go ahead and set it to the side and grab our second layer, which will become the inlay, and again position it face down, inside, up against the clamps. And I'm ready to repeat the same procedure. Remove that fallout. And if I wanted to salvage the second layer, I could actually make another mat, another inlay, by swapping the 2 components out. It's the second layer that I'm going to insert into the first by taping the 2 together. Cleaning up my workspace with a nice flat table, I'll take the inlaid part of the mat and by feel and sight both, make sure that it's in perfect registration in the previous opening. And when I'm happy that they align nicely, I'll use a small piece of 811 tape in the corners to keep everything in position. And then go ahead and use longer pieces of the same tape to attach the inlay together. And now the 2 components have created a very nice looking inlay. Now to cut the opening, I could invert the mat blank and cut from the face as we've done in all our other examples. However, my mat board would have to be precisely, exactly the dimension we require so that we don't lose any orientation. Or I can cut the opening from the back side using my reference mark here. And that's what I'm going to do in this example, putting the 2 boards up against the clamps. Now changing the settings from dials to 3/4, top and bottom, left and right. And turning the head, cutting counterclockwise. Removing the mat. And there's our inlaid. The next mat we're going to cut is referred to as an open V-groove or a 3D double bevel. It appears to be a more complicated mat than it is. I'm going to sketch this out for you right here. It's essentially an opening which exposes the board below it with a panel of mat continuing on with another bevel so that the undermat, or the second layer, runs completely across, and you expose the color both at the inside of the artwork and in an area within the mat design itself. In our example here, we're going to cut first the top mat at 3 inches while the 2 boards are attached together, and follow this with the interior mat cut at 3 3/16 of an inch to this bevel here. And that's where we'll begin. My 2 mat blanks are 16 by 20. This will be the top mat. This will be the bottom mat, which will also be exposed on the open V groove. And I will ATG these 2 boards together. Now with my double layer of mat board, I'll place this into the machine up against both clamps, securing the mat board in position. I'll start with my stop set at 3 inches on the left stop, 3 inches on the bottom stop, 3 inches on the right, which means it's sitting at 17 inches, 3 inches below on the top stop, which means it's sitting at 13 inches. Once again, make sure that your star dials are cleared to 0. And we're ready to cut our opening. Orienting the cutting head first, we make our first opening cuts. Setting the fallout aside. Now we'll change the star dial so that this gives us our 3/16 of exposure of the bottom mat. 3/16, 3/16, 3/16, and 3/16. Once again, bringing the head to the magnetic stops and beginning at the upper right, we cut the bottom mat. Out comes that fallout. Now we're actually ready to cut the reverse cut, creating the 3D panel. We'd like to make this panel 1/2 inch wide. That means that my stops will then change from the original 3 inches to 2.5 inches. So I'll start here and change the left stop to 2.5 inches. Also set the star dial to 0. The bottom stop I'll set to 2.5 inches and set the star dial to 0. The upper stop needs to be set to 13.5 inches, and the right stop to 17.5 inches. And again, make sure that it's set the star dial to 0. 0, 0, 0, 0. Now because we're cutting a reverse cut, we're going to orient the head so that it's traveling downward, and we travel in a counterclockwise direction. I now desire to create the moat or the channel, the exposure, or the open V groove. I'd like to show 1/4 inch of that color, that dark green exposed here, which means I'd like to move my settings out another 1/4 inch. So my setting of 2.5 going inward would become 2.25 on both the left stop and the bottom stop. The top stop would change from 13.5 to 13.75, moving in an outward direction, which makes sense. And the same thing on the right stop, from 17.5 to 17.75. Again, making sure these are all set at 0. They are indeed. I'm ready to make my final cut on the mat design. Orienting the head, traveling in a traditional manner. We're cutting from the face, so I'm going right, inserting the blade, now as we complete this cut, it's going to be real easy for that material to fall loose, and indeed it does. Both the area we removed and the panel in which we would like to retain this part of the design. I'm going to save these two components and orient them the way they were exactly cut. Clearing off my work table, I'm going to set these two components down, realign them as they were cut, and I'll go ahead and use some of the 3M removable tape, the 811 tape, just a little bit, apply it to the outside, temporarily keeping these two components in registration. I'll then flip these two over, and using the narrow ATG tape, I can apply a small band of adhesive on the interior of that little panel. I then take my mat out, place these two components back into their position, and you can see how that little cutaway area is going to keep everything in registration again. And this time, as I lay it down, I'll apply a little bit of pressure on the interior component, locking it down. Now we can remove the little open V-groove area and we have a perfectly executed 3D double bevel mat. Now we're going to cut a large multiple opening mat. Multiple opening mats, of course, require a little bit more patience with the numbers involved. And the mat we're going to cut in our example here is similar to the one you see mounted on the side of the machine here. 5 openings, but we're cutting a larger mat, 32 by 40 inches. The brown mat that we're looking at represents our bottom mat. And we're going to lay the mat design out very similar to this with 2 large horizontal openings on the upper layer and 3 openings on the bottom layer. The 2 smallest ones left and right will be somewhat vertical. So I've done the math, figured out that I'd like to have a 1-inch spacing between the openings, and I'd also like to put a V-groove surrounding all the openings, pulling them together. So let's cut our V-groove first at 3 inches from the outside of the dimensions, and we'll insert our second layer. So this will be our top mat, going on top of the second mat, and we'll cut one on top of the other, but we will not ATG them together at this time. Being multiple openings, we'd like to take them off the machine and carefully apply the ATG tape between all of the individual openings. Both mat layers are now up against the clamps, and the 2 layers and the slip sheet, all 3 are engaged underneath. The first thing we're going to cut, of course, is our V-groove. So to set the V-groove up, we want that 3 inches all the way around. So I'll set the left stop to 3 inches, tighten securely, set the lower stop also to 3 inches, set the upper stop to 3 inches below my 32 inches, which means that would be sitting at 1, 2, 3, 29 inches. And finally, the right stop 3 inches short of 40 inches, and that would be 37. Making sure that all of our stops have the star dial turned to a 0 setting. Putting our cutting head up to the magnetized stop, and up on the left, the magnetic stops will help keep our cutting head traveling straight as we're moving across the machine. Because we're cutting such a large, oversized mat, we'd also like to now utilize the 2 upper stops running on the horizontal plane to help keep the gantry stabilized. So what I will do to tighten those in position to match what we did below is bring the head to the upper position and lock the head so that the head is now holding the gantry stable. I can then loosen the top stop and bring it along until the magnet kisses the edge of the gantry and tighten. That means that we're now matching the upper stop to the lower stop. I'll now do the same thing on the right side, loosening that stop and sliding it over, bringing the cutting head over to the right until it engages the bottom stop, once again lowering the cutting head and positioning the top stop so that it clicks and tightens. Raising the head, and now our upper stop matches the bottom one. We're now ready to make our first cut. Setting the head in the correct direction for the V-groove, and remembering to turn the dial to 1 millimeter, the V-groove depth. We'll then insert the blade, cut, rotate, and the fourth side. Finish the V-groove, we'll rotate 180 degrees. And there we have a very large V-groove. Of course, for perfection, we may want to clean the corners up just a little bit before we sell this to our customer. Now that the V-groove is finished on our large multiple opening, let's proceed by cutting the first opening in the upper left corner. That opening is a 10 by 16 opening, so I need to set my left stop to 4 inches, 1 inch inside of the V-groove. And while I'm doing that, I'll go ahead, secure the head so that I can tighten the upper stop to match. Okay. Now I need to set the upper stop 4 inches from the outside edge of the mat, 32. That would be 28 inches. Now 28 inches minus the 10-inch opening means my lower stop would be set to 18 inches. You can arrive at this destination either by adding, in this case subtracting, the opening dimension to find the bottom stop, or by adding the mat from the 0 mark upwards. You can go in either direction to determine this reference point. The right stop would be 4 inches plus the width of the opening, 16, means our right stop would be sitting at 20 inches. And again, these are all set to 0. 0, 0 on the star dial. And you can see now that we'll travel right, left, bottom, left, and back up again. Let's go ahead and secure our upper right stop at this time, locking this here, holding the head down, and bringing the upper stop into position and tightening. And now we're ready to cut our first opening. So by putting our cutting head in the upper left position and orienting the cutting head so we're cutting horizontally, and then changing the blade depth to 1.5 millimeters, we're ready to make our first cuts. There's our first opening. Without changing any of these measurements, we'd like to keep the second mat in perfect alignment under the openings of the first mat. So let's leave the stops where they are and simply add the increment to create the second layer. If we want a 3/16 exposure of the second mat, we dial to 3/16. If the person prefers a 1/4 inch exposure, we dial to 1/4 inch. So we'll go ahead and set 3/16, 3/16, 3/16 all the way around. Remembering now that you've not only got 4 settings, 1, 2, 3, 4, we now have 6 settings to change. And we're ready to repeat the same step-by-step procedure. And there's our second mat. Once again, we'll adhere these two boards together after all the openings are cut. I'm now actually ready to cut the second opening, which is slightly smaller than our first opening here. This image here was 10 by 16. The next opening to the right is 10 by 15. And I will make the first change in the stops by starting on the right side, loosening both the top and the lower stop, and bringing them over to the right. I know that I want that opening 4 inches in from the perimeter, which means 40 inches minus 4 is 36. Setting the lower stop again first, bringing the gantry over until it kisses, locking in the top stop and securing it in place so that the two are in agreement. The left starting point would be 15 inches away from that, so 36 minus 15 would be 21. So I bring the bottom stop over to 21 inches. Again, sliding it over until it makes contact and bringing the top stop over so that it agrees, and securing it in position. Making sure that all of my star dials have been recalibrated or repositioned back to 0. Remember, I'm cutting the top mat now, not the bottom mat. I'll change those when I'm ready to cut the interior or the second layer. So starting in the upper left-hand position, orient the cutting head, and proceed cutting the top layer. Now we'll change all the star dials back to our 3/16 inch setting. And starting over again with the same procedure. Now you can see one of the advantages of the Mat Pro machine. By cutting from the face and cutting each layer one after the other, we have a distinct advantage over a manual straight line cutter in the alignment of multiple openings. We've now worked our way down to the final opening, and we proceeded to cut these in kind of a clockwise manner, that way taking advantage of previous settings on the measuring stops. So this last setting, we've got everything calibrated here, 4 inches with the star dial set at 0. The upper setting is where we'll begin. We have the right settings, and we also have the upper set stops locked in position to help assure stability in our cutting of this large multiple mat. Ready to cut. Once again, we change to the 3/16. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 settings. Upper left against the magnets. Position the head. And make our cuts. Release the clamp, and we now have produced our large double-layered multiple opening mat. To adhere these together, I would separate the two boards and apply the ATG tape between the openings as well as around the perimeter. The next mat we're going to cut is a title opening mat. Another version of a multiple opening where we have a small aperture below the main opening to incorporate a title. Often this is done with a single opening in the upper layer and perhaps a double mat on the main opening. The mat that I'm going to cut for our example here is actually a duck stamp mat where we are framing a federal or state duck stamp with an opening Often a standard size utilized is 15 by 16 inches. And rather than have the extra opening centered, we're going to position it off-center to the right. And to add a little bit more dramatic presentation to this, we'll cut a V-groove in the surface of the top mat, tying around the opening and tying the small title together. With our 15 by 16 mat, I've adhered the two boards together. And once again, I'll place those into the machine up against the vertical and the horizontal clamps. I'll then set the stops for the V-groove dimension, 2 inches off the bottom and an inch and a half on the top and the sides. I've set the stops and I'm ready to cut. Set the dial to the correct depth, turn the head to the right orientation, and proceed to cut. Half of the V-groove, 180 degrees. And there's our V-groove. Now we'll cut the small aperture for the duck stamp mount itself. That opening is 2 by 2 5/8 of an inch. I'll now set the stops to those settings. We're now cutting the small aperture or the title opening in the bottom right-hand corner, 2 by 2 5/8 inches. So I've got my stops calibrated, 9 3/8 of an inch in, to an ending point of 12 inches, 4 inches over, 1 inch from the bottom, and the opening being 2 inches, which means I set the upper stop for 3. Starting in the upper right-hand corner, once again I orient the head, have the blade depth set properly, and proceed to cut the small aperture We'll leave the bottom of this mat uncut. This gives us a platform in which to mount our stamp in its proper mount, or if you were doing a title plate, it would be a place to adhere the title plate. We're now ready to cut our main opening, and our opening actually for this duck stamp print is 7 5/8 by 9 1/8 fractions. Don't you love them? Okay, so that means that our bottom opening will sit 3 3/4 inches from the bottom of the mat. The left opening is sitting at 3 1/4, 3 1/4 in on the right, and the top 3 1/4 from the top. Making sure that all of our star dials are set at 0. I start in this upper left-hand corner, orient the cutting head, and cut the main opening. That's the main opening removed. To that main opening, I can add 3/16 of an inch, cutting the second layer simply by turning my star dials, all 4 of them, over to 3/16, and beginning again in the upper left-hand corner. We've now cut a title mat, in this particular case, specific title mat that has an opening for a duck stamp print. During many of the projects that we've just been working on, we were cutting an awful lot of 4-ply material, and the slight variation from manufacturer there will deviate a little bit. Even materials, of course, like the black core mat we just cut in our previous project may require a slight adjustment on the blade depth. So instead of setting it about 1.5 for standard 4-ply, we may have to set it to about 1.56, 1.55, somewhere in there to accommodate the different thicknesses. 6-ply, of course, requires a slight adjustment as well. When we're dealing with 8-ply material, it is obviously much thicker. And the substantial increase in 8-ply boards requires, now if we make an adjustment here, that adjustment will put the blade deeper through the material, but unfortunately we'll lose control of our overcuts. So rather than change the blade depth adjustment for 8-ply material from the back of the cutting head, we're going to loosen the cutting head and actually change the position of the red roller wheel. Removing the cutting head, you can clearly see the red roller right here, and it has a mark on the interior which tells us this is the factory setting for depth, which will allow it to roll at the correct height for standard 4-ply mat board. To change this for 8-ply, I need to loosen the little locking screw that holds it in position, and then adjust the wheel by lowering the red wheel. This will automatically have the blade cut deeper when it plunges down to the mat board. Then I can re-tighten that new position and then reinsert it to test to see if it's at the sufficient depth to cut 8-ply material. The change that I make here should be about 2 millimeters. Once I've made that change and I've tested it and I'm very happy with the results, I might want to put another secondary mark on the side of this head to indicate the 8-ply setting as well as the 4-ply setting. Once the red roller has been properly calibrated to the appropriate depth, cutting 8-ply material, rag board, on the Mat Pro is as easy as cutting any normal mat board. Standard openings as well as V-grooves and multiple openings. Your Fletcher Mat Pro 120 and 150 will look like this when you receive the machine. If you elect to purchase the optional right side squaring trimmer, you need to install this. That trimmer does include the clamping and cutting head. You'll need to attach the handle. It does also include a wrench for attachment, the scale to install, and a small spring to stabilize that scale, 2 bolts for attachments, 1 top and 1 bottom, the additional washers and nuts, and of course the magazine to install inside the cutting head, and a pair of measuring stops. Before we install the trimmer to the Mat Pro, it's easier at this time to go ahead and install the scale into its appropriate channel before we actually attach the trimmer to the base of the machine. So setting that aside, I'll slide the scale in from the longest dimension first into the channel. And at the end, we can insert the small spring so that the scale slides over it and keeps the scale snug into its appropriate position. To install the right squaring trimmer, you'll notice that 2 bolts protrude, 1 at the top and 1 at the bottom. So the first thing I'll do is find the appropriate holes for these to be inserted and slide them into position. Take the washers and nuts and securely attach these from the back. Before tightening these to the final position of security, make sure that you have enough play in there to insert the 2 bolts that slide into the horizontal members. Again, 1 at the top and 1 at the bottom. And with the 4mm Allen key that's included with your machine to begin with, we can thread these in, tighten these securely, and once that is done, we can come back with our wrench in the back and tighten the nuts on the back side. Before I insert a piece of mat board to determine if my trimmer is square, this is the primary function of the trimmer, is to produce mat board blanks before we cut our openings on the left side of the machine. And we also need to make sure that our scale has been set in its proper position so that when we measure a dimension, it actually yields that measurement. So we need to calibrate both of those functions. Before we do that, however, we do need to connect the air line that will actually cause the clamp to work. Behind the machine, we'll see 1 extra little L fitting that we can simply remove the plug and insert the fitting into its quick release position like this. Then we connect the air supply back to the machine. With a fairly large piece of mat board or foam board, it will also work, with a nice straight edge on it, we'll lay this down into the material rest and slide it underneath our trimmer. The scale has been arbitrarily slid into position. To see if that measurement is correct, we can go ahead and set our board to the closest dimension that's readable, in this case 18 inches. We'll clamp the board, bring the cutting head to the upper position, insert the magazine, which utilizes, of course, the same blades that the cutting head does on the pneumatic side. Insert the blade, tightening it in position, and trimming off or squaring up our piece of material. Release the clamp and measure that dimension to see if indeed it's 18 inches. What I'm getting right now is actually 18 and a little over an eighth. That means I need to move this scale slightly inward I'll try another dimension. This time I'll go for 17 inches, reading it straight up and down, reclamping, bringing the cutting head upward, trimming, releasing the clamp, and remeasuring 17 and a 16th. We need to move it over just a little bit more, and we're fine-tuning until we get our scale precisely on. Let's go to 16 inches, clamp, trim, release. Perfect. Once you're happy with the scale being in its correct position, that 16 inches is actually yielding a 16-inch cut, you can take a pencil and go ahead and mark one of the reference points, 4 inches, 10 inches. So you've got a zeroing point. If the scale ever gets repositioned, you can come back to your home setting. Once the scale is now precisely set, we'll grab a larger piece of mat board, or preferably foam board, large enough that we can make cuts top and bottom and determine if our vertical alignment of the trimmer is material rest. That's the test we'll now do. By taking the material across at least 50% through the trimming head, clamping it in position, and while I'm clamping, I'm holding this side of the material flush against the material rest, so that when I bring the cutting head up and make a short cut, I then release the blade and bring it to the bottom of the material and make another cut at the bottom. Release, and you can clearly see I've got one cut here, one cut here. By flipping the board, keeping the base on the bottom, what I'm really trying to do is bisect this 180 degrees by seeing if the two 90-degree cuts will intersect at the top. If they do, our material is perpendicular. So by sliding the material across from the back side so that I can see the bottom cut, and I can make sure the blade will insert into the same position, I hold it steady, clamp it again. The blade lines up at the bottom. I now bring the blade to the top and recut the top. If those two cuts intersect, we've successfully bisected 180 degrees and our trimmer is perpendicular to the material rest. If the second cut is slightly out from the first, we need to bring the bottom out to bring those closer together. If the second cut is slightly in, we need to bring the top out so that the two will line up perpendicular to each other. If our test mat yields perpendicular results, we don't need to do anything. If we do need to make changes on either the upper or the lower, repositioning the trimmer so that it's perpendicular, we first loosen the two nuts on the back side and the two bolts that hold it to the horizontal members. Once those are loosened, we can insert the 3mm screw into these two ports and do the minor adjustments, either pulling this out or taking it back in if you need to. Once that is done, we retighten the bolts and retighten the nuts to keep it secure. General maintenance with your Mat Pro involves keeping the overall exterior of the machine clean. A draftsman's brush wiping away any debris that's accumulated is a good idea. It is not necessary to oil or lubricate any of the moving parts on the outside of the machine. We will disassemble the cutting head and take it out of the machine right now and show you the one area where a small amount of lubrication can be applied. I removed the cutting head from the Mat Pro, and the first thing I'm going to do for safety reasons is remove the blade . I can now then release the spring tension on the blade holder. By removing this spring, this will facilitate the blade holder traveling up and down. This is where at least once a month we'd like to apply a little bit of silicone lubricant to facilitate the wear and the life of this blade holder. About once a year, once every 2 years, depending on the usage of your machine, you may need to replace the red roller. To do so, with the same 2.5 millimeter Allen key, we'll loosen the small screw behind the roller, again with the blade removed so we don't cut ourselves. Turning that screw, out comes the small roller. And it has two parts, the roller and the interior holder. And this is the part we're actually replacing. If you replace the red roller, you simply reinsert it onto the bushing, place it back into position, and retighten the screw. You want this to be fairly snug, so a little bit of pressure here. And then, of course, we're going to replace the spring. When replacing the spring, turn this down until the spring sits slightly above the blade holder. When you replace a new red roller, you'll need to readjust and recalibrate for your 4-ply depth setting.